Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this conversation on ending the debt crisis for women. We have three amazing speakers with really deep expertise on debt and development, and we're very excited to hear from them today to share their knowledge about this topic. And before I jump in, I want to do an acknowledgement of country, which is I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live. And for me, that's the land of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and that sovereignty here was never ceded. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And if you're joining today from stolen land, please take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of where you're working and living and playing. So in terms of the program for tonight, this conversation is hosted by ActionAid Australia. My name's Kat too, and I'm the head of campaigns and policy. I'm going to invite our executive director, Michelle Higelin, in a second to give some opening remarks to set the context. Then we're going to invite our three speakers to have a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, sharing their expertise on this topic. So today we have Lidy Nacpil, who's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. We have Dr. Claire Slatter, who's the chair of the board of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, otherwise known as DAWN. And then we have Wangari Kinoti, who's the Women's Rights Policy Advisor for ActionAid International. So after our panel discussion, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions from you. So please don't be shy, please post your questions so we can draw on the very knowledgeable expertise of our panelists, and then we'll finish on the hour. So I'll keep reminding people to ask questions because it'd be great to get the conversation started on this. So I'm going to pass first to Michelle to give us some opening remarks before we move on to the panel discussion.
Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know for you, Wangari, it's the morning, and Lidy, it's probably a little bit earlier too. Also a really big welcome to our three inspiring speakers. We're really thrilled to have all three of you with us tonight, and looking forward to the discussion. In terms of the rationale behind this, I mean, we're now at a situation where 26 million people have been infected by COVID-19. It's seeing no signs of abating, and even here in Australia we've entered a second wave, but in countries like Afghanistan where ActionAid works, I mean, we now see a situation where 1 in 3 people have been infected by COVID, and that is just expected to grow in many countries around the world. As a global women's rights organisation, ActionAid is particularly concerned about the gendered impacts of COVID. We're seeing a clear spike in violence against women in pretty much every context where we work. Women's unpaid work is on the rise. An estimated 1 billion women are estimated to have been left destitute because of working in informal areas of work or casual areas of work, which have been hardest hit by the economic lockdowns. So the gendered impacts are quite extraordinary. From ActionAid Australia's perspective, we believe as a wealthy nation, Australia can and should be doing more to support particularly low-income countries to be able to fight back against COVID-19. At the moment, there's 2 areas we're campaigning on. One is around aid. The UN estimates that more than 500 billion is needed in increased aid to be able to support low-income countries. So we currently have a campaign that's focused on pushing for the Australian government to commit to 2 billion additional aid over the next 2 years, so that we can see Australia sort of playing a more important role in terms of resourcing countries where they most need it. And the second area, which is why we're here tonight, is around debt relief. Many of the countries we work in spend more in debt repayments than they do in, things like health and education. Debt distress was a serious issue pre-COVID, and it's only gotten worse over this period. So our current campaign is really focused on how can we really work in collaboration with others to really push for Australia to play a critical role alongside other G20 nations to cancel debt, both principal and interest repayments, up until the end of 2022. There's been small steps towards this, but it's not enough. And so tonight we really wanted to create some time and some discussion to really talk through the issues around debt and why this is such a critical thing in terms of all countries having the ability to respond to COVID. And so we're really thrilled to have, the three of you here tonight to give us a strong global perspective. And we really hope this will be a starting point for all of us to be working together to make sure this is a core part of how we respond to COVID. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Kat.
Thank you, Michelle. So now we're going to move on to the panel discussion. So first I'm going to invite Lidy Nacpil to speak. So based in the Philippines, Lidy's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and co-coordinator of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. She's also on the coordinating committee of the Financial Transparency Coalition, and she's vice president of the Freedom from Debt Coalition. So Lidy, it's a privilege to have you here. I wanted to start off with the context. So as Michelle said, we're in a debt crisis. Low-income countries' debt has doubled in the past decade, and the number of countries facing a debt crisis has also almost doubled since 2018. These figures that we have, they don't even account for the full impact of COVID-19. So starting from the beginning, can you talk us through what the debt crisis is and a bit of the history of it? How did we get here?
Yes, thanks, Kat. I'm also very grateful for this opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. I'm going to turn off my video just in case my sound will be affected because internet here is very weak and we have a raging storm. So I hope it's not going to stop altogether. So I think it's very important that we start with the history of the debt problem and the debt crisis and how we got to this point. And it is already several decades long that many of the developing countries are facing this huge problem. I'm sorry I have to take us back to the 1970s. Some of you probably weren't born yet then, because it's very important to talk about the origins of the crisis and why developing countries have huge debts. Is it just because we love to borrow money and we're not able to manage our resources? And there are several important factors that led to this problem. In the 70s, there was a time when finance capital from the North, or what we referred to then as the First World, needed to find new markets for financial investments because the markets in the North were already saturated, and started lending aggressively to what was called the Third World, or the South as we call it now. So lending, of course, was seen as a business, how to invest your money, your capital, and then you get returns from interest payments. Commercial banks and international financial institutions made it very easy for third world governments or southern governments and private corporations in the South to borrow. And this is what we refer to now as supply-driven lending or peddling of loans. This is not about the South begging to be lent money. This is about northern and financial institutions, private banks, and even governments really actively and aggressively pushing loans. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, most developing country economies were and are still, I should say, oriented in such a way that we have a net outflow of resources. We generate wealth inside our country, but much of this wealth leaves the country. So this is by means of export of raw and semi-finished products, but on very cheap terms or unfair terms of trade. Huge import bills for fuels and expensive finished products, domination of multinational corporations who were repatriating the profits they were making and are still making in our countries, and weak manufacturing sector and agricultural sector. And all of these are legacies, for most of our countries, legacies of colonial rule, and propped up by continuing unfair global economic relations. So all this led to this situation of shortage of domestic financial resources, weak infrastructures, quote unquote, underdeveloped domestic economies. And this was an easy way to justify the peddling of the loans, and the heavy borrowings that our governments were doing. They keep saying, we need the money, we don't have enough money, so they keep borrowing. Or the lenders would say, well, you need this money, you need these loans, and we are making this available for you. And some of these loans are in the form of what is called aid, ODA. So when you talk about ODA, most people think it's just grants. Actually, a financial mechanism is called aid, even if only 25% is grants and most of it are loans. Major developments followed, of course, after that. Oh, I must mention, I'm sorry, but it's also important to mention that at that time, 70s and 80s, there were many authoritarian and dictatorships in the South. And you'd think that this would be a problem for the lenders because now they talk about good governance. But at that time, the lenders, the creditors did not see this as negative, but rather positive, because these governments had the might and the authority to ensure that debt service will be prioritized. In the Philippines, the Marcos dictatorship passed a presidential decree of automatic payment of debts. So before all else, debts will be paid. And this law, this is now a law in the country, and it continues to this day. Many major developments followed, which made it very difficult for many developing countries to deal with what then was already a staggering amount of debt because of the easy borrowings. The steep rise in oil prices, falling prices of exports, increases in interest payments because many loans were based on floating interest rates. So dollar revenues were falling, debt servicing requirements were soaring, and new loans were being contracted to keep economies afloat. So now you had a vicious cycle of borrowing in order to pay debts. And this is where we are today. And many people don't mention that this is this history. It's as if you just take it a given that, you know, poor countries borrowed a lot and now they're having problems to pay, and debt cancellation or debt relief is seen not as a matter of justice, but as a matter of charity towards these countries. No? I'd just like to mention just the last 2 points. First, you know, debt crisis and debt distress is largely defined from the point of view of creditors. There is a crisis or there is distress when borrowers are at risk of or no longer able to pay debt service in full and on time. As long as you're paying, you have no arrears, you're paying on time, they don't consider that you're in debt distress. When even if in your situation you are unable to meet the minimum requirements so that your citizens can have basic essential services. It was only later when creditors started acknowledging debt distress in terms of constraints on public spending, but still their debt sustainability framework is so narrow. So unless you're insolvent or not liquid and you're still paying on time, even if you're undergoing severe constraints, you're not considered on the agenda for debt relief. Aside from a narrow framework on debt sustainability, and I promise this is my last point, unless you want to hear the history of debt relief, which we have a lot of things to say about debt relief in the past. The framework on debt sustainability is just that, on sustainability or the ability to pay and service your debts. What we have raised in the past 2 decades is this issue of illegitimate debts. This is not just about whether we can pay. It is about whether we should acknowledge this as our loans, the people's loans for which our money is being used to pay, when many of these debts did not benefit us at all, or even did not even comply with the basic democratic requirements for contracting these loans. And they did not even, in many instances, not benefit us, but also were spent on harmful projects. So we consider it also very unjust, fundamentally unjust, to keep paying loans for which we never benefited at all. So I'll stop there because I took a long time already. Thank you so much.
Yeah, those are really good points, and to hear the legacy and the history as well is really important to understand why this is an issue of justice, essentially. I just want to remind people there is a Q&A box at the bottom, so please post your questions so our panelists, we can get to them at the end, our panelists can answer them. And also, just to create a bit of community, it'd be great to also have you pop in who's here in the chat as well, just so we know, because we obviously can't be meeting in person, but also we wouldn't have the privilege of having people from all over the world speaking on tonight if we did. So thanks, Lidy. My other question is, clearly this crisis that we are in right now isn't new, and it's the continuing of an ongoing phenomenon, as you've highlighted to us by going back to the 70s. Can you talk us through, in this context of COVID-19, how the debt crisis is being accelerated by the pandemic that our world is facing right now?
Sorry, I was on mute. There are several ways that the pandemic and the economic crisis that's following in its wake is really exacerbating the debt problems. One, obviously, is the fact that instead of debt relief being offered, because they're only offering it to a few countries with very little amounts and under very short term, instead of offering debt relief, they're offering more loans. And so the World Bank has announced new loans for COVID relief, the ADB, the IMF, and many other bilateral financial institutions. So instead of freeing us from this situation of the vicious cycle of the debt problem, it's going to sink us deeper. We might not immediately feel the impacts because you're going to receive some cash transfers, but certainly in the months following, when you start paying off, you're going to be in even more difficult situation. Secondly, of course, is economic production. Economic activities have really slowed down and contracted. And thus, the ability of countries in debt to earn the revenues that are needed to pay off loans are severely hampered and severely restricted. So what are they going to do? Are they going to impose more new taxes on citizens, which are already severely hampered by the economic crisis, without even talking about the debt? So this is really how we anticipate this situation, or maybe not just anticipate, because it has already started happening for many countries. And so the world should stop thinking about more new loans for COVID-19, because in the medium term and in the short term, it's going to put us in deeper despair.
Thank you. Now I'm going to bring in Wangari. So Wangari Kinoti is based in Kenya, and she's an African feminist leading global policy work on women's economic justice and structural violence for ActionAid International. Over the last 16 years, she's campaigned on women's political participation, women's rights to natural resources, land, corporate accountability, women's paid and unpaid labour, and violence against women. So we're very lucky to have Wangari with us here tonight. So Wangari, I wanted to ask you, what has been the role of patriarchy in fueling the debt crisis? So for those who don't know, patriarchy is where men hold the power and women and people of other genders are excluded from it.
Thanks, Kat. I'm also honored to be part of this panel, especially with co-panelists whose work I really admire. So you know, I'm definitely amongst them. I would say that, as some people have observed, really neoliberal capitalism and patriarchy are inseparable. Capitalism establishes particular social relations that facilitate the exploitation of women, and patriarchy provides the justifications for it. So that's why, for example, we will have, we see that 4 hours and 25 minutes worth of unpaid work women do daily remains largely invisible and recognized, undervalued. That is, that's a function of both patriarchy and capitalism. Here we're talking about the work of caring for children, taking care of the sick, taking care of the elderly, cleaning homes, washing clothes, meal preparation, collecting water and fuel such as firewood in communities where this is the main source of fuel. 3/4 of this work is done by women. In total, 16.4 billion hours per day are spent on this kind of work, which is the equivalent of 2 billion people working 8 hours per day with no remuneration. And if these services were to be valued based on an hourly minimum wage, they would amount to at least 9% of the global GDP, or 11 trillion US dollars. Anyway, this distribution is patriarchal, it's inequitable, and it's unsustainable. And it both results from and drives wage disparities. It lowers incomes. It results in poorer education outcomes and negative physical and mental health impacts for women who, obviously are doing the vast majority of it. So by failing to provide publicly funded and delivered gender responsive basic and essential services, including health, water, sanitation, transport, childcare, and so on, including services to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, governments are not only exploiting women's unpaid labor, which is taken to be, it's taken to be elastic and infinite. It will always be there. But governments are also failing to deliver on fundamental human rights. So when debt means that global financial institutions pressure states to reduce social spending, impose austerity policies, deprive people of common goods, women who carry the weight of it. And that's, a combination of factors produced by both by, neoliberal capitalism and sort of the financial system it produces, but also of patriarchy. Women basically provide huge subsidies to governments through their labor. In fact, feminist activists have been stressing that women are both borrowers and lenders. Feminist activists, you've seen the sort of feminist strikes and action around debt, particularly in Latin America, where the slogans are around you or us as women, for our work and for our labor that which provides subsidies to governments when they fail to provide public services. So states spending more on debt servicing while they underfund public services transfers both labor and costs to women and girls. And one of the ways we've seen that is through, and Lidy spoke a little bit about the issue of privatization of public services, where for women we encounter particular challenges. One is, first of all, financialization of public goods basically means that we're commodifying and trading on fundamental rights. Secondly, this myth around private sector service delivery, that it's more efficient and so on. It basically means that what we see is, a falling or dropping in standards. So workers may face lower wages and labor standards, and especially in the social sector, which is a major source of employment for women. We also see situations of shrinking political space and deficits in democracy. Lidy spoke about the fact that citizens were not involved in getting these loans and negotiating the terms and so on, but it is on citizens' backs that we then have to the debt crisis is falling on the backs of citizens, and particularly on women. And this is in a context where women already have little or no collective political agency over macroeconomic policies. This just makes it worse. And in fact, what we've seen, particularly in the case of PPPs, large infrastructure projects and so on, we've seen cases where women are being threatened, jailed, or faced violence when they protest against certain projects. So we've seen that with women human rights defenders, many of whom are usually protesting, some large infrastructure project or other project that will affect their community and their livelihoods. PPPs, we know, are expensive. And when it comes to women, where user charges are imposed for services, not just PPPs, but privatization in any form, when user charges are imposed for services, it becomes extremely burdensome on women who are already restricted by disproportionate poverty and caregiving, as we know. So women have to either fill the service gap themselves or spend already restrained income in order to access services for themselves or their households. So those are some of the reasons why debt continues to be a central point of feminist organizing. Debt results and benefits from multiple and intersecting forms of oppression, including neoliberal capitalism and patriarchy, and they are really self-reinforcing.
Thanks, Wangari. And ActionAid International recently published some research looking at the impact of the debt crisis on public services such as healthcare and education, which you've touched on a bit. Can you just talk us briefly through some of the key findings and how this is impacting women living in poverty and exclusion?
Yeah, okay. So ActionAid recently released a report titled "Who Cares for the Future? Finance Gender Responsive Public Services." It basically looks at the connection between unpaid care and domestic work and public services and the role of debt, austerity, and tax. So it's quite a long and comprehensive report, but there's, both the full report and a summary of it are available on the ActionAid website. But the central argument is that publicly funded gender responsive public services are key to redistributing unpaid care and domestic work. And generating decent work opportunities for women. So ActionAid worked with the organization Jubilee Debt, which I'm sure many on the call might be familiar with. I think I saw somebody talking about joining us from Jubilee Debt, basically to examine 60 low to middle income countries, looking at how much of their revenue they spend on debt servicing versus how much goes into public spending. And the main finding related to debt was that higher spending on debt means a continuing deepening exploitation of women's unpaid care and domestic work to fill the gaps. I would say also paid care work, because we know that women are the majority care workers, even paid. But this is usually precarious work. It's poorly paid. It's precarious, and there are a lot of vulnerabilities that women are exposed to in this work. So anyway, Congo Brazzaville, the Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, Sierra Leone, and others are spending more on debt servicing than they are on health and education combined. And many other countries spend the equivalent of over half of their total budget for health and education just on repaying their debts. The report also sort of estimated how much extra cash countries would have on hand to add to their overall budgets for public services like health, education, water, if their debt servicing was reduced to a threshold of 12% of government revenues. So for example, Bangladesh and Ghana would each have had over $5 billion to invest in public services every year. Kenya would have $4 billion a year in extra revenue. If the spending on debt was less than 12% of government revenues. So to quickly go over the overall main recommendations from the report, number one, it's about governments having to pursue expansionary macroeconomic policy and counter-cyclical investments in gender-responsive public services. So this is about resisting the IMF cult of austerity and wider constraints to public financing in whichever form they may come. It's also about, the report is recommending that governments should invest more in non-military public sector personnel and resist the public sector wage bill containment, again advocated by the IMF, but also about government setting ambitious targets for increasing tax to GDP ratios in a progressive way. So targeting an increase of 5% in the coming years and an increase of 10% by 2030. So that revenue is what would then go into funding gender responsive public services. And then quickly also, calling on governments to immediately suspend debt payments in order to finance domestic responses to COVID-19, and then renegotiate debt servicing for the future so that it does not exceed 12% of national budgets, which I mentioned before. So this would also include pushing for an independent debt workout mechanism and ensuring that new loans are negotiated with full transparency to Parliament, to media, to citizens, and so on, including women's rights organizations and movements. And then finally, the report is calling on governments to focus on rebuilding the national social contract around public services. So resisting the ideological push for privatization and PPPs, and just reclaiming democratic sovereignty over critical social and economic decisions, and putting their citizens first.
Thank you. And now I'm going to bring in Claire. So Dr. Claire Slatter is the chair of the Board of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. She's a retired University of the South Pacific academic with teaching and research expertise in development politics, economic and trade justice and women's development. And Claire is based in Fiji. So Wangari touched a little bit on the international financial institutions like the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. So Claire, since you're based in the Pacific, we'd love to hear how these issues play out in that area. So from a Pacific perspective, how are international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank impacting development in the region?
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, I'm not going to put my video on as well because I'm in a room which sometimes the connection's a little bit, intermittent or whatever.
Sure.
Thank you, and thank you to the other speakers. Yes, the question to me is about the Pacific. So IMF and World Bank began advising structural adjustment or economic and governance reforms in the Pacific Island countries from the early 1990s. This was interesting because, you know, often the austerity measures are proposed where you have, you know, debt crises or, you know, countries that are owing, and it's used as a kind of, you know, conditionality for loans to help you deal with or meet your debt or service your debts. But in the Pacific, the World Bank in one of its first reports, or its first report, said that Pacific Island countries had a modest debt exposure. But the reason for them proposing structural reforms was that Pacific Island countries were seen as actually enjoying a very high level of aid and yet showing very little economic growth. So that's, you know, the rationale for it. So those early reports were pushing for structural adjustment, but it was actually the Asian Development Bank, even more than the IMF and the World Bank, that was the main international financial institution which primarily drove and financed the economic reforms in Pacific Island states. And this began in the, well, sort of about the middle 1990s. And the ADB led, you know, a kind of in a partnership with other donors, the whole reform agenda, and they worked in collaboration with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, which is the premier intergovernmental body in the Pacific. And it was the classic kind of reform agenda of, you know, structural adjustment policies. So I won't go into that because I'm sure you all know about that. This was financed through loans and development aid. And, you know, millions of dollars therefore received through well, the Pacific Island states were borrowing then. The SAPS loans continued through the following decade, you know, from the 90s into the 2000s. Apart from saddling the Pacific Island countries with considerable debt, the loans to the Pacific Island countries to support structural adjustment from 1996 onwards really changed the focus of governments in Pacific Island states to an over-preoccupation with economic growth, with attracting foreign investment, incentivizing the private sector and celebrating the success of multi-million-dollar companies, and much less emphasis on redistributing the benefits of growth. And in recent years, we've seen the impact of that, of this kind of growth-centered economic development strategy in its multiple manifestations and strategies of implementation. And we see it in the increased inequality between rich and poor in the region. The first regional quadrennial report on the SDGs, for instance, shared the finding of recent household surveys in 7 Pacific Island countries and territories. And the report was that extreme poverty is relatively low, but that an estimated 1 in every 4 Pacific Islanders are living below their national poverty lines. And that elderly people and other vulnerable groups were at risk of falling into hardship or poverty. The adoption of the neoliberal model also made Pacific SIDS more export-import dependent, export/import dependent, which means more extractive industry dependent. And the extraction of minerals, liquid gas, and also forestry in those bigger countries of the Pacific Island region, which have those resources, has caused enormous, and they're foreign-owned industries, They've caused enormous environmental destruction as well as social dislocation, discord, and in some instances, open conflict. The regional fisheries industry, while it's earned substantial revenue for states, especially under a licensing system which was instituted by what's called the parties to the Nauru Agreement. These are the countries in the Pacific in whose waters, territorial waters, the tuna largely are present and located. This actually has continued, has given lots of earnings to Pacific Island countries, but there's continuing problems of illegal, unreported and unrecorded fishing by distant water fishing nation vessels in high seas pockets outside of the EEZs of the Pacific Island countries. And at the same time too, we have the risk of the climate crisis, possibly causing a migration of what is left of the tuna fishery. So, the intensive, if you like, exploitation of all of those natural resources have been problematic in a number of ways. There's also an even more worrying interest by a number of Pacific small island developing states at their interest in the possibilities of engaging in the extraction of polymetallic nodules from the deep seabed in partnership with the first venture capital companies, the initial venture capital companies that are wanting to go into this. Today, the debt levels of some PICs are extremely high, and according to the most recent figures, which are published by Jubilee South Campaign on its debt data portal, Papua New Guinea and Tonga are currently in debt crisis. This is a little ironic because Papua New Guinea is the most resource-rich of all PICs, but it just really sheds light on, they talk about resource, the whole, the irony of having resources and yet actually having very poor social indicators and so forth. So it's kind of referred to as resource curse. While Fiji's debt to GDP is very high and the subject of much public discussion and opposition discussion, it primarily consists of domestic debt rather than external debt, although Fiji's external debt is beginning to increase. And today, the primary worry about debt in Pacific small island developing states is centered on the loans for infrastructure development by China or its Exim Bank. China is now the region's second largest donor, and there's mounting concern about the possibility of some of these loans being debt for equity loans rather than concessional loans. The concerns over these loans, which of course arise from US and its allies' geostrategic interests in Pacific small island developing states, because they have sovereign control over a significant area of the Pacific Ocean and its rich marine and seabed resources. But this has seen three responses from the traditional donors to Pacific Island states. Firstly, a protective concern, particularly by Australia, about the debt traps that Pacific small island developing states have entered and the risk of sovereignty loss if they're unable to repay their debts. A second response is an evident move to emulate or to compete with China in supporting infrastructure development in countries of the region by offering similar development loans in addition to aid. And the example of this is the $2 billion Australian infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific, which was recently set up. And the third response is the announcement in April and July 2020 of new ADB emergency grants and loans to PCIDs to help finance their COVID responses. So this, resonates with what Lidy was talking about, new loans that are being offered, including in some cases, the loans to cover provision of social protection measures. I think this has to be understood in the context of the geostrategic situation with, China, the US, So, the question is this increasing level of financing of development in the Pacific Island region, possibly returning the Pacific region to the era of the Cold War, where Pacific Island states enjoyed the highest per capita aid to keep them on the right side of big power rivalry. Is this also what explains the increased securitization of aid in the Pacific region? So it's kind of an interesting, situation. But I I think in terms of, you know, what Lidy was explaining about not forgiving debt, but cancelling debt, you know, and in recognition of the fact that not only were debts often in the global South countries run up by very undemocratic regimes, you know, there is an argument that can be made that actually these debts were incurred, you know, by unaccountable regimes, and also without popular participation in the decision on taking these debts. One also can calculate how much of the debt has been paid. You know, it's often said that debts have been settled, you know, umpteen times over, and yet you're still owing. So those kinds of arguments, I think, are, yeah, very valid.
Thanks, Claire. And you touched a little bit on this, and this is a really big question, but we don't have a lot of time. But how do we reverse the legacy of colonialism and the negative impact of international financial institutions in the region? So some of that might be resolving the debt crisis. Yeah.
I mean, just one thing that I want to point out is, you know, in relation to this question, Kat, is that actually we have continuing colonies in the Pacific. So it's not just the legacy of colonization, which is something that's past, you know, and we're all independent. We have a number of continuing colonies. And I think firstly, we need to end colonialism in the region. It's shocking that there are still in the 21st century colonies in the Pacific region, whatever they may be termed or called. And I'm referring here to Kanaki or New Caledonia, to Maui Nui or French Polynesia, and to West Papua. We need to push more strongly for decolonization and for the realization of the right of self-determination. And some of the NGO groups, the CSO groups, as well as states, actually, you know, particularly around West Papua, but also for Kanaki and Maui Nui, have been pushing for them to, you know, for the Committee of 24, whatever it's called now, to get on with moving them towards self-determination. We also have the legacy of nuclear colonization and the unfinished business of nuclear justice for, you know, the ongoing health problems and environmental damage in those countries and peoples who are subjected to nuclear testing by occupying colonial powers. And as for reversing the legacy of a dominant development model, neoliberalism, I really think that I can answer this question in relation to the last question you gave me, you know, on feminist approaches. So I might just hold for now and you know, you may come back to it.
Yeah, because I wanted to move on to solutions. If anyone's got any questions, please pop them in now. We've only got about 15 minutes left. But Lidy, how effective have past measures been to deal with the debt crisis? And what do you think is needed this time to resolve the debt crisis and protect women's rights, noting that we only have about 15 minutes left to finish off the conversation?
Okay. So before COVID-19, we had two major debt relief initiatives coming from the creditors, the HIPIC and Enhanced HIPIC in the late 1990s. And then in 2005, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. And there are two things that we need to say about this. First of all, they're on very narrow terms of what they perceive to be debt problems. So they involve too few countries, only the most impoverished in their view, and also the most indebted in their view. So the parameters that they have laid down just involve just too few countries and too little of the actual huge amount of debt that is being collected from the developing world. The second is that the main objective, and they have been quite explicit in this in forums that we have participated in, the main objectives of HIPIC and also of MDRI was to clean the books and enable these countries to borrow again. And not only borrow again, but to enable them to borrow from financial markets, which of course lend on market terms and not on the concessional lending that these countries used to avail of. When we say clean the books, it's because most of the debts that were canceled were actually not being paid anymore. They simply could not be paid by these countries. And so it was just a matter of canceling debt and not really actually having savings or debt relief. And then they came with conditionalities. All these conditionalities tied to loans are also conditionalities tied to debt relief. So now we have the two major debt relief initiatives of the IMF and the G20, the DSSI. And again, one of the critique is too few countries, too little debt, and making sure that creditors are paid. The IMF debt relief is actually a grant extended to the eligible countries so that they can use the money to pay off the debt service and that is being collected from now till 6 months later. So it's still, again, yeah, it saves money for the countries, but you can see that first of all, the IMF is interested in making sure the creditors are paid. DSSI is simply a suspension of that service. So when the suspension is over, you go back to paying. And again, it's just very few countries that are involved. The worst of this is that many countries are afraid to avail of debt relief because, and they say this on record, it will affect their credit rating and thus their ability to borrow again from the financial markets. What are the solutions? There are many, but it also, because we don't have time, but the most important thing is that it needs the political will, strong political will among borrowing governments and also among creditor governments, because they also share a big part of the responsibility for the crisis we're in. And that means we really need to campaign hard so that we can push them out of their comfortable boxes. And that means also making sure that we have that political force necessary for them to consider other options other than what they consider, what they actually say, the market realities and market instruments.
Thanks, Lidy. And Claire, talking about feminist approaches, what can they offer us when we think through a new approach to debt and development? Claire, you might have to come off mute.
Yeah. Sorry. I think that Lidy and Wangari are probably more familiar with feminist approaches to debt, because I don't actually myself work on debt as such. But I covered that years ago in teaching and also in my thesis. As I said earlier, I think it's actually really important to kind of unpack debts and to look at, how much has been paid. I think we can actually marshal a very strong feminist argument, if you like, on, the injustice of debts. Yeah, how much has been repaid? I mean, these kind of, financial arrangements for how much interest you pay and how it's all sort of based on this idea of sovereign lending that, countries never go bankrupt. Irrespective of what government is in power, the debts will always be paid. So you've got basically countries over a barrel, yeah? But no one really looks at how much they have actually paid in servicing the debt and, building an argument around that being just totally unjust. I also think that what should be argued is that certainly in the Pacific, there's such underrepresentation of women, for instance, in governments and in parliaments, that really they did not have anything to do with approving, loans that are made by governments. It's an argument I think that we should seek to use, that, not in our name, and to argue it again in terms of, the injustice of this debt. The question also talks about, what a new approach to development could be. And I think that feminist organizations can, some of them already doing this, but play an important advocacy and social mobilizing role in campaigning against borrowing from predatory lenders and against attracting foreign investment on high risk terms. Because it's not just, the debt, but it's, things like public-private partnerships, which carry contracts that include investor-state dispute settlement clauses to protect investors by enabling them to sue states, for instance, if, any policy changes are made that actually interfere with their expected returns on an investment. So, actually really playing that advocacy role, we can push for more investment in agriculture, for national food security rather than for export, trying to change basically the whole sort of neoliberal model of export-oriented production and, looking for your niche in markets abroad, instead of actually really doing what's mostly important, which is to actually feed your nation and to provide for you know, the well-being basically of all people within your national borders. And I think that COVID has actually shone the light on, you know, how wrong-headed the economic model that we've been working with or following has been. And it's time to actually change. You know, you don't want to see people in a crisis having nothing, which is what, you know, has been the experience in some places where sort of a major industry like tourism has just kind of ended and you have masses of people out of work. Yeah. So
thank you. And Wangari, since a lot of us are dialing in from Australia today and we're part of the G20, we're a global north wealthy country, what role do countries like ours have to respond to the growing debt crisis, and how can civil society in both creditor and debtor countries work together?
Well, okay, so about 350 African feminists recently signed on to a letter to the group of African Union special envoys who are appointed to mobilize international support for economic recovery post-COVID on this continent. And the point that this group of feminists were making is that this was, you know, just as Claire has just said, this is about using this moment to acknowledge that the old ways are not working. This is the moment to reimagine political economies wherever we are. And it's also an opportunity to dislodge structural inequality. So I think my first point is that it's really important to listen to groups like this. And, you know, listen to what these groups are saying. Individuals and civil society groups in rich countries like Australia have to show real solidarity, you know, call out governments, call out private capital and transnational corporations, resist, you know, the extractivist models. And it's not only about debt, but the capital outflows from poor countries to rich ones. So think about the people who are in these economic processes and negotiations and dismantle power relations between rich and poor countries. Civil society working together, you know, from creditor and debtor countries. Sorry, my screen is jumping around, so I just need
we
to
can
go
hear
back
you
to
still
my
now.
Notes.
We can hear you still now.
Okay. So I was just saying that there's some examples of society in both creditor and debtor countries working together. A live example right now is a joint advocacy targeting finance ministers at the UN, leading up to the UN General Assembly in flying overhead. So there's some sound, there's some background noise, it will pass. So basically, the Women's Working Group, their effort aimed at reaching a consensus on a global economic architecture to tackle COVID-19. So this group is calling for extensive debt cancellations. It's calling for the establishment of a sovereign debt workout mechanism at UN level, a UN tax convention to address tax abuses and other illicit financial flows, because these are obviously also part of the debt question. A review of private financing of development and reaffirmation on the importance of public finance. So again, resisting privatization and austerity. And then a review of official, first the decline in ODA, and also to ensure that long-standing commitments to national development assistance are fulfilled. These commitments are made by, governments, including, for example, Australia. So these are some of the efforts that we want to see rich countries leading and supporting and working and have sort of that sort of cross-organizing between creditor and debtor countries.
Thanks, Wangari. And we only have 4 minutes left. I have a question here. It's not directly related to debt, but a really important issue on West Papua. So Claire, Jennifer asks, what suggestions do you have for freedom for West Papua? I know we don't have that much time, but I was wondering if you had anything to suggest to Jennifer.
Sorry, it's a hard one, you know, and West Papuans are losing their lives and are being subject to such horrible human rights abuses. And there is a, you know, there needs to be an attention to trying to stop those human rights abuses, firstly. But in terms of the, you know, the future of West Papua and it having any hope of decolonizing, I think that there really needs to be a way in which you can hold the UN to account, because actually what happened to West Papua and why it didn't become independent, just as Indonesia became independent, really was an agreement between the Netherlands, the US and the UN. You know, so they actually have to be made accountable, or accountability should be laid at their door as well as to the door of the other two parties. I don't know how that could be done, but I think we need to think through how we can use existing international courts or international systems of seeking justice to bring that, you know, that whole case of West Papua back to the UN. You know, and I know that it's difficult, you know, bringing things to the Security Council where you can have, you know, permanent members basically vetoing and it gets stuck there. But I think that one needs to find some clever lawyers who can think through how one legally challenges, but also politically puts the ball back in the UN's court.
Thank you, Claire. And to wrap up, I'm going to call back Michelle, our Executive Director, to close off with some remarks.
Thanks very much, Kat. A huge thank you, Wangari, Claire and Lidy, for speaking tonight. It's been wonderful to benefit from your rich experience and knowledge around debt. And also a big thank you to Kat, who did a great job of moderating. I really want to thank all of you for joining us for this event. You know, debt, it's not an easy topic, but it's critical. I mean, I think as we've heard tonight, if we really want to make an impact, this is one of the key things that we can focus on to unlock resources for public services, for things like COVID stimulus, the kind of things that people in Australia benefit from. You know, other countries have that same right. So I think this is a critical area. Definitely, we hope that you'll continue to stand with us as ActionAid as we mobilise with women on the front lines of the COVID crisis, and particularly focus on how we can put pressure on the Australian government to cancel the debt. You can find out more about our campaign at our website, actionaid.org.au. And specifically on our website, there's a petition you can sign, which we're trying to collect as many names and that we can sort of send to the government so that they know that this is a critical issue that Australians do care about. There's also one of the key areas, Wangari mentioned the UN General Assembly and the focus on finance ministers there. We're particularly targeting the meeting of G20 finance ministers in mid-October. So there's an opportunity also via the website where you can write directly to Australia's Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, and tell him that this is a critical issue. The more people who can join that, I think it will send a very strong message that Australia needs to look at this in terms of its COVID response. And I think picking up on what Claire was saying, you know, stop creating new models of debt that just aren't sustainable over the longer term. And definitely we're looking for opportunities to partner with other organisations. And I do want to acknowledge Jubilee, who've been on this call. You know, they've been a long-standing partner with us around focusing on debt. So it's great to partner with Luke and the team at Jubilee, and we hope we can partner with other organisations who've also joined this call. But thank you everyone for joining us, and do stay in touch, and you know, let's start to mobilise, because this is a critical issue where we can get traction if we do show that there's enough Australian support behind this issue, and working obviously collaboratively, globally, benefiting from you know, the rich networks. And it's been wonderful to also have people I see from Kenya, from Fiji, and other parts of the world on this call, because I think together we can try and really send a strong message to our governments that this is a critical issue. So thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
have a good night.
And I've popped the link in the chat if you want to check out our debt campaign and any of the other resources ActionAid has as well. But thank you so much to our panelists and to the team at ActionAid that made this happen. And enjoy your mornings, days, and evenings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.